Okay, so unfortunately for me, I didn't save my project. So that let's just keep that as a reminder to always be saving your progress. Otherwise, you could lose everything. What I had to do here is go back to my perspective view. Um, I had to recreate my shape here. It's not really what I like. It's not doesn't look like what I had before. I was a little bit more happy with, but this will work for what I am going to try to do with it here. So let me just scale my camera up and go back to my camera view. So this is, I think, where we left off. Before I get into the camera attributes in the attribute editor and how to set certain camera parameters, because now after you, for this project, after you've kind of decided on a kind of composition that you think is interesting for each of your render view, each of your rendered images, you can really manipulate a lot about what you're looking at. So right now we just have kind of a bunch of gray cubes on a black background. There's no lights added to the scene. There's no materials added. And so by adding all of those things, we're going to really be able to change what we're looking at here. So before I can get into some of the ways that the camera can kind of the ways you can kind of explore the way the camera will render something. Let's talk a little bit about lights. So we talked a little bit already about the different types of renderers, and so we're going to be working in Arnold renderer. And so lights between a Maya renderer and Arnold renderer are a little bit different as far as how you have to set some of the attributes for those lights. But you can use, there's two types of lights under rendering here. I have my standard Maya lights, and I'll go into what these are. And then I also have some Arnold lights, some specific lights that just work with the Arnold renderer. But I am going to use some of these standard Maya lights, and just by changing some basic parameters, I'm able to get some pretty nice lighting effects. So I can also create lights by going up to create and selecting this lights drop down menu. And so the first one we have here is ambient light. And right now, what we have in our scene actually, because we are on just texture mode, I believe, or we're just on a shaded mode, is the mode that we're using to view. But if I go to lighting, and there's a kind of standard default light that will light the viewport, but it's not actually a light in the scene that will render out. So let me just double check here my render settings. Okay, so I am rendering in this kind of preset here, saving it to a JPEG. Okay, that's good. So if I go now to my render view, open up my render view, and in my render view, I have, it says it's under the Arnold renderer here. I'd be able to change what my renderer is here, so I want to stay in Arnold renderer. And then if I go and I hit this clapboard here, it's going to render out my view. And you see that there's nothing in my scene. The other thing here gives you some information at the bottom of our render view, though. It gives me the size, so this is the correct size, 1280 by 720. And it tells me how long it's taken me to render this scene that we're not able to see because there's no lights in it, which is 3/10 of a second, and or 3/100ths of a second, and or is that 3 seconds? Let's see, 1, 2, 3. So that's 3 seconds, excuse me. This is minutes and then seconds, how long it takes to render. And then the camera that we're rendering from is actually the perspective camera. So let me go up and change that under render and say down here under render, we want to be rendering because we want to be rendering here under camera 1. So just make sure that that setting is set. Now you'll see that our what we have displayed down here will read out the correct information. Even though we're not rendering anything, we want to make sure we're rendering from the right camera. Okay, so there's no lights in the scene, even though we can see our scene here. Okay. And so if I actually go over to lighting and say use all lights, you see that nothing's being rendered. There's no lights on our scene. But I can use my lighting view in order to be able to preview or approximate what my lighting situation is going to look like in Arnold or when I'm rendering it. So let me start with a couple different lights. This ambient light here, if I create an ambient light, is just going to flood in a kind of unrealistic way every cubic inch uh, of my scene. So let me now go to my render view and go and try to render this. And actually, this is going to, if I go actually, let's go to Maya software and render so we can kind of see what this looks like. So I have a kind of like very even lighting over all of my objects using this ambient light. If I go down now to Arnold Renderer and render this in Arnold, I'm not seeing anything. And the reason is, and this is why, you're able to use standard Maya lights for Arnold, but Arnold renders at a realistic, what's called a drop-off rate. And so if I go into my light here, and let me collapse my render view, and under intensity here, I would have to increase the intensity quite a lot in order to be able to see it. The drop off is depending on the distance from where your light is, how does the light kind of grow dimmer the farther you are from the light object. And so in a kind of realistic lighting situation in the real world, it works on a kind of quadratic drop off. So there's for different lights, you're able to adjust for that drop off, and I'll show you that in a second with some of these other lights. But here we would have to bump up the intensity quite a bit in order to be able to see this light. And this light isn't necessarily super realistic. You're welcome to use it. Let's say I bump up the intensity though to like 1,000. Let's see if that does anything in Arnold. Still nothing. If I bump it up to, let's say, 100,000, if that's going to do something. Okay, so that took 11 seconds to render. And this is good to be aware of because we really don't have anything complicated in our scene and it takes a little bit of time to render. Let's bump this up to 100,000 and see if it'll render. And still nothing. Okay, let's try a different light. If I go now though to Maya software and let's render this out. You can see just how bright this light is. I mean, you're not getting any detail. It's just flooding. It's flooding your scene with white light just on the objects because this kind of, the space of Maya renders as black, but that's something you can also change in the camera settings. Okay, so an ambient light is just a very, very basic light that just floods your scene. I can create a new light in the scene, or I can also change what type of light I'm working with here. So let me go down and actually change this to a point light. And a point light is like a bare light bulb in a room type of light. Let me make this a little bit bigger so we can, oh, with the point light it doesn't necessarily matter, but now that we have this lighting, this lighting mode on, we're able to see kind of how this light is working. And we also have the intensity bumped up quite a bit here. So let me see, because this is a very large scene also that I've created. I might have to kind of adjust some of the intensity. But what a point light is ooh, and I did something that I don't want to be doing. I'm in my camera one view, and as you can see, even if I try to undo my camera position movement, I'm not able to do it. I'm only able to change, the movement of, I've been just changing the movement of this point light if I hit undo. So make sure, this actually is a good thing to just do at the moment. Let's just go back for a second and let me change this to perspective view for a second and select my camera. And I want to go into my channel box and layer editor, and let me just create a new layer, and with the selected object. So make sure my camera is a part of that. And I'm just going to turn this on to rendered, but it's something now that I don't want to be able to move. But I do believe actually even if I'm in my camera view, I'm still going to be able to move it. Yeah, I'm still able to move it. Okay, scratch that. It's not how you do it. You just have to be aware, I guess. You don't want to be aware of what mode you're working in. Otherwise, you can always just readjust it and find it again. And there's a way you can like lock the camera in place. Let me see if I can figure out how to do that just really quick. And I'm sorry that I'm taking a little bit more time than I need to with this. There's a way to lock your camera, and it's not the way I just showed you. Here it is, lock camera. Okay, so now I'm not able to move my camera. Okay, so now that I have my composition set and I've locked my camera, so if I can't toggle around, I know I'm in my camera one. Okay, so as I was saying anyway here, I'm talking about moving this light around my scene, and I have here in my attribute editor. Okay, so now this is where you can see I'm still at like 100,000 of intensity. And let's take a look at if this is going to be rendering in Arnold. So in Maya, again, because the intensity is so bright, it's flooding everything with light, but you can see that a point light has some distance to it. It's like an object. It's a light object in a way where there's not necessarily a renderable object here, but like where its position is compared to the ambient light will determine what gets illuminated by that light. Let me now try this in Arnold and see if this is going to work in Arnold, if we get anything. Okay, there we are. So you can kind of see that there is a bit of, this is extremely intense light, so it's even more intense than I need to for Arnold. So I want to maybe bump this down by a couple zeros and just try it at 1,000 and see what 1,000 looks like. And so now I'm getting a kind of softer light in my scene here. I can see it in my render view. I'm not rendering the whole scene, so maybe I'd want to change and add a couple other lights. You can duplicate lights in your scene or cameras the same way you can duplicate any other objects by hitting the Command D key. A couple other attributes here. Okay, so this actually brings me to, I was talking about this kind of fall off or this decay rate. And so in my viewport, I have it set to no decay. So this light doesn't decay over a certain distance. And that will match up pretty well to what something like the Maya software renderer looks like when I render this out. So these look, fairly similar as far as the lit objects. But if I'm working in Arnold, which we will be, and I want to see maybe in my viewport, so I don't want my viewport all blown out since I'm working in this kind of lighting mode, I can go here to the decay rate and I'm going to change this to quadratic. And when I do that, this gives me an approximation of what my Arnold renderer, how it will render the lights here in my viewport. Okay, so I have a single light. Let me go ahead and maybe duplicate this point light in the scene and move it somewhere else. Maybe move it up here so I can start to illuminate some of these cubes. I think what I wanted to do is go into my perspective view. So I'm able to, maybe I want to be looking at both of these views here. So I'm able to just more easily move my light here. So something like this maybe would work. And let me do my render view and hit this clapboard, and I will get, so now we're starting to kind of render out some information from our scene. And we just have some 2-point lights. I can talk about a couple other lights that we have. I will probably do that in the next video since this is getting to be kind of long. But I want to just quickly, say you can change the color of your light if you want. So if I double click here on color, I get a color wheel. So maybe I'll do like a green color for my light and hit done. Okay, so my 1-point light that I have highlighted here is now green. And let me do a little render view of that now. And so I'm not adding color to my objects, I'm just adding a kind of color to my light. And even that has some kind of nice effects here for what I'm seeing as far as creating a kind of abstracted composition. So I'm going to go into some of the other lighting objects in the next video.